Today we're up to the 6th part of my series, Where's God? And I got the number right on my slide behind me. So that's, I better have. I'm not going to look, I believe it's there because I did do it. So today we're up to the 6th part, and the title of this series, and we're taking the entire year actually, well I am, to just really unpack where God is in our world today. And we're doing that by looking at where God was in the past, because there are a lot of lessons that we can take from the Bible that will help us to navigate these times that we find ourselves in. The truth of the matter is, you can't just depend on your parents' faith. You can't just depend on the faith that you had 10 years ago. You have to have a personal relationship with Jesus, I believe, to navigate the times that we are currently in, because the times that we are currently in are quite confusing, quite distressing, quite difficult to navigate for just about everybody on the planet. The change that we've been seeing over just even the last 2 or 3 years has just gone right through the roof. Now we can blame that on social media, making us more aware of what's happening around the world, but our world is in a bit of a mess. And there aren't too many answers being put forward by world leaders at this point in time. I don't have great confidence in some of our world leaders right now, and some of the decisions that they've been making, invading other countries, the way they talk to each other and talk about each other, the way they treat other people within their own nations. It just doesn't give you a huge amount of confidence at times when you look at that. Then you look back a little bit closer to home and you see some of the struggles that we've got. Petrol prices are going through the roof. It's going to be interesting once that 22% discount, 22 cent discount comes off. There's all sorts of stuff happening at the moment. We've had a change of government. Or there's a lot of uncertainty in our community. And none of it took God by surprise. No. And when we look back over the Bible, back into the pages of our Bible, we realise that God has been working out a plan for thousands and thousands of years for the salvation of humanity. And we're right in the midst of that plan right now. Now we've got a couple of 3 scriptures that are key to this series. The first one is found in Daniel 11, where it says, "The people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits." If you want to be strong, if you want to be able to bring peace wherever you go, and to bring peace wherever you go, which is indicative that you've got an answer that a lot of the community or the people around you don't have to be that type of person, you will need to know God yourself personally. The people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. Matthew 5:8, "God blesses you when your heart is pure, for then your eyes will open to see more and more of Him." You want to see God? Then you need to deal with some of the stuff that you've been hiding away in your heart, and you need to sort it out. Because it's the people whose hearts are pure who will see God. That's not a heavy rap. That's just, listen, you weren't meant to have some of the stuff that you're struggling with in your life. Humans weren't created by God to struggle with some of the rubbish that we struggle with. And if you want to see God in your life, if you want to see more of God, then stop blaming the world around you and start to look at what's going on inside of you and deal with some of the unforgiveness and some of the habits that you are engaging in that aren't helping you to see Him. Now it's gotten quiet. Jeremiah 29, verse 13. God gives us a great promise in the Old Testament. He says, "If you look for me wholeheartedly, you will find me. I will be found by you, says the Lord." Now, when you read a story from the Bible, there can be 3 things happening all at the same time. And I touched on these last week, but I feel just to just remind you of them again. Firstly, there's God's overarching plan for the redemption of humanity, moving along at God's predetermined pace within His foreordained time frame. Now, the outcome of His overarching plan is totally unaffected by anything that happens on the earth. It doesn't matter who's in government. It doesn't matter what's happening around you. God's plan is coming to pass exactly on time. Nothing takes the one who knows the future by surprise. So that's one thing that can be happening in the stories that we read. But secondly, God often uses the events that are happening as a lesson to future readers or a precursor of something that will happen in the future. It's a bit like what's been happening at the Grace Centre over the last 6 years. I've always believed that God is using our church's corporate experience as an example and object lesson for our own personal lives. The message that we have a hope that's greater than our past has been demonstrated time and time again through each improvement that we've made down at that old pub. The steady progress that we've made through our consistent effort, punctuated by God's provision over and over again, has been a signpost pointing to all that God has wanted to do in each of our lives, personally. The big questions about community and our purpose that we've been grappling with as a church are questions that God has been asking of us individually as well. And then thirdly, there is God's personal interaction in the lives of the individuals that we're reading about. So the first one is God's plan. The second one is God using the story as an example of something for the future or trying to get a message across to the readers. And thirdly, there is God's interaction in the lives of the individuals that we're reading about. Now, depending on which book of the Bible you're reading, there'll often be a different emphasis being highlighted. It can cause you all sorts of issues if you read everything with only one filter on. The early books of the Bible are setting up God's unfolding plan for all of humanity, and at times the stories that we read can seem a little bit harsh and impersonal if the only filter you're using is the third one, God's personal interaction in the lives of individuals. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't take something away that's meaningful to your own particular situation, which is what we've been doing over these weeks. But it's important to be aware of the filter that you're using when reading the text as opposed to what the author might have been trying to convey. Now, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Good. Now, last week we started to look at the life of Jacob, and we saw that Jacob had a character quality that God was able to use. And when you read through his story, you begin to see how important it was for him to get to the place where God wanted him to get to. He had an ability to persevere in the midst of extremely tough personal challenges. When Jacob meets with God and has his name changed after leaving his uncle, God highlights this quality when he says, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." There's something about the ability to keep on keeping on that attracts God's attention. Jacob had received a promise from God that he would bless him, and yet he faced obstacle after obstacle. His trust in God's promise was tested time and time again. God really likes it when we trust him. The only problem is that we very rarely enjoy any circumstance we find ourselves in that require us to trust him. Because the need to trust implies a lack of something that we're hoping for. So one of the greatest things that you can do in your life to prove your love for Jesus is to trust him. But that will invariably mean, trusting invariably means that there is a lack in your life at this point in time. And you are hoping and trusting in Jesus that things will change, things will shift, things will turn around for good. So it might sound, trusting God sounds great, but the reality of it is in our lives it is often difficult. And I keep having this argument with God. I tell him all the time I think he takes too many risks. If I was God, I'd make life a lot easier for people. And then he says to me, "Dermot, that's why you're not God." Consistently trusting God in the face of reversals and setbacks changes us over time on the inside. Just as Jacob received a new name and identity, we too can see our lives change for the better if we persevere and don't give up. Now Jacob heads back home from his uncle and he reconciles with his brother Esau. His family is still a mess, though, and he loses Rachel, his favourite wife, just after she gives birth to Benjamin, who is one of two sons that were born to her, Joseph and Benjamin. Joseph was the older one. And it's at this time that we see God getting involved once again in Jacob's family, and he gives Jacob's son, Joseph, 2 dreams, which kickstart a chain of events that end up saving the entire family years in the future. But it doesn't start off well. In fact, from the outside, it appears to be an absolute disaster. Joseph receives 2 dreams from God, where he sees his brothers and parents bowing down to him, and in the ignorance of youth, he decides to share it with the whole family, as you'd expect from someone with zero self-awareness. Now, obviously, that does not go down very well. On top of the favoritism that Jacob constantly shows towards Joseph, because he was the son of his favourite wife, his dream becomes the straw that breaks the back of his relationship with his half-brothers, and they end up selling him to slavers and telling his father that he'd been killed by a wild animal. That escalated rather rapidly. Joseph is then taken by the slavers down to Egypt, where he's sold to an official in Pharaoh's court, the captain of his personal guard, Potiphar. Just when you think things couldn't get any worse for Joseph, Potiphar's wife takes a shine to him and tries to get him to sleep with her. But Joseph refuses, as by this time he's developed a fairly decent relationship with Potiphar and has been given a position of responsibility over all of Potiphar's household affairs. Potiphar's wife doesn't take Joseph's rejection very well and accuses Joseph, slave Joseph, accuses him of trying to rape her. And Joseph ends up in prison, unjustly accused for a crime that he didn't commit. And whilst he's in prison, 2 of Pharaoh's attendants get thrown in with him, and they both have dreams. Joseph interprets their dreams, and he asks the Pharaoh's cupbearer to remember him after he's been released and put in a good word for him. The baker wouldn't be able to do that because his dream pointed toward his execution. Now the cupbearer gets released. He's restored to his previous position and promptly forgets the promise that he had made to Joseph. Time passes, and Pharaoh has a dream, which no one can interpret. And his cupbearer finally remembers Joseph and tells Pharaoh about him. Pharaoh immediately calls for Joseph, and Joseph interprets his dream. Pharaoh realizes that something supernatural is going on, and being a bit of a superstitious fellow, because he's the Pharaoh of Egypt, they've got all these different gods, he puts Joseph in charge of Egypt, answering only to him, with the explicit task of preparing the country for the 7 years of famine which will descend on Egypt after 7 years of plenty, which was Joseph's interpretation of his dream. And that's exactly what happens. There are 7 years of bumper crops during which Joseph makes sure the surplus is stored and put aside for the 7 years of brutal drought which follows. The drought impacts all of the nations around Egypt, and many of them turn to Egypt for help to survive. Jacob and his family, which is growing, his sons, and they've all had kids, there's quite a number of them now, are one of the groups of people who are saved because of Joseph's efforts. To cut a long story short, they get reunited with Joseph, who is big enough not to make his brothers pay for their treatment of him in the past, and the entire family clan relocates to Egypt and avoids being wiped out by the drought. Now, aren't you glad I didn't read that all from the Bible? I gave you the cliff notes for it. Here we have, and you can thank my wife for that. She brought that up the other week. So here we have God's plan for the entire world being brought front and centre as the fledgling nation of Israel is saved from extermination by Joseph being in the right place at the right time. And only God could have orchestrated that. In the midst of God's plan taking place, we see how God interacted with Joseph. And whilst at times it appears a bit harsh, there's enough of God's grace in Joseph's life for him to be able to hold on to God through all of his reversals and setbacks, and then see God's hand at play in the salvation of his family. In Psalm 105, David, from the vantage point of hindsight, and everybody's got 20/20 vision in hindsight, composes a song to celebrate God's plan outworked through the nation of Israel, and in the middle of it, he mentions Joseph's trial. Psalm 105, reading from verse 16 to 22. He called for a famine on the land of Canaan, cutting off its food supply. Then he sent someone to Egypt ahead of them. That's a nice way of putting it, isn't it? Yeah. Send someone ahead of them, you know. You just go ahead and get rid. Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They bruised his feet with fetters and placed his neck in an iron collar until the time came to fulfill his dreams. The Lord tested Joseph's character. Then Pharaoh sent for him and set him free. The ruler of the nation opened his prison door. Joseph was put in charge of all the king's household. He became ruler over all the king's possessions. He could instruct the king's aides as he pleased and teach the king's advisors. That little statement right in the middle of that passage I just read out. Until the time came to fulfill his dreams, the Lord tested Joseph's character. The Amplified Bible puts verse 19 like this. Until the time that his word of prophecy regarding his brothers came true, the word of the Lord tested and refined him. And then the Passion Translation puts it like this. God's promise to Joseph purged his character until it was time for his dreams to come true. Now for just a moment, I want you to place the unfairness of Joseph's situation to one side. And I want you to ask yourself, what was it that was really important to God in this story? What was God wanting to happen for Joseph? Obviously, there's God's plan for the whole world ticking away in the background. And at that time, it hinged on the survival of Jacob's family line. But what was God up to in Joseph's personal life? The future hope of the nation of Israel depended on Joseph staying connected to God in the midst of everything that happened to him. Right up until Pharaoh called for him, you couldn't say he was the epitome of success. There wouldn't have been anyone looking at Joseph going, I want to be like him when I grow up. But Joseph was an amazing young man. When you read Joseph's story, you come away with the impression that he never once faltered in his trust in God. If anyone had reason to, it would have been him. Betrayed by his own family, sold into slavery, falsely accused of attempted rape of his master's wife, and then forgotten by everyone whilst locked up in prison with no release in sight. He could very well have given up on his trust in God, but he didn't. And how do I know that he didn't? Because at each major crossroad in his life, God is front and centre in his mind and in what comes out of his mouth. When Potiphar's wife wanted to sleep with him, we read in Genesis 39, 8-9, but Joseph refused. He said, look, he told her, my master trusts me with everything and his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. When he was thrown into prison, we read that God was with him. Genesis 39, 20-23. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held. And there he remained. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favourite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. Who do you think spread that story? Joseph did. When he caught up with his parents, when he caught up with his dad and his brothers, and he was telling them about what he had suffered and gone through. He was the one who told them that because there was nobody else who lived it. Joseph told them that. That was his testimony. He was able to say that when he was in prison, God was with him. And he succeeded in everything he did. And the favour of the warden was on him. And God's loving kindness was there with him. Then when Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker had dreams whilst in prison, in Genesis 40, verse 8, and they replied, we both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean. Joseph says, interpreting dreams is God's business. Go ahead and tell me your dreams. And then when he's brought before Pharaoh, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream last night and no one here can tell me what it means, but I have heard that when you hear about a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph replies, it's beyond my power to do this. But God can tell you what it means and set you at ease. Now Joseph wouldn't have been bringing God up time and time again if he was blaming him for his predicament. And yet God was the one who allowed Joseph to go through everything he went through so that he would be positioned exactly where he needed to be to save his entire family line from extinction. It's great having some hindsight, isn't it? It's great being able to read a story that's already taken place. We have as Christians, we have an incredible ability to bounce back from adversity because of the hope that God brings into our world. Only God can lead us into tragic circumstances and still bring about the very best for our lives every single time. Paul picks up on it when he writes in Romans 8:28, and we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. Are you committed to God's plan for your life? Do you trust him enough to remain faithful to him even when everything seems dark around you? When the hopes, dreams and expectations you had for your life just don't seem to be coming to pass? See, that's a question that life will ask you over and over and over again. Because so oftentimes the expectations that we have don't seem to be matched by our experience. And if we're not careful, we can do what Joseph didn't do and blame God. Or worse still, turn our backs completely on him. If you'll do what Joseph did, then all of heaven will work together on your behalf. If you continue to put God first in your life, you'll continue to give him access to your life. And even in the midst of terrible circumstances, even in the midst of deep depression, even in the midst of trials that you're going through, you will see the hand of God's blessing on your life. You know, when we bought here in Rugby, I wouldn't be able to say that I was feeling very positive about the future. I can't say that in myself that I had a lot of energy or strength for the next round, the mountain that we were about to embark on. I can't say, when I look back at the way I felt at the start of our time here, that I was feeling like I was where I wanted to be or thought I'd be at that stage in my life. And yet in the midst of all of that, by just simply putting God first, I started to see the blessing of God in everything that we were doing corporately as a church. Now obviously there's a lot of other people involved in it. I'm just telling you my story from where I was as the pastor of the church. I was kind of like, I was thinking, God, I don't have the energy, I don't have the motivation, I don't have the passion, but I've got to lead, so I've got to keep on telling people about a good, positive future. But I'm struggling with that. And yet in the midst of that, I saw door after door after door open up in our community. And I saw our church taking ground in our community in a way that I have never, ever seen a church do before. Now, I'm sure there are thousands, millions of churches around the world that have experienced what we've experienced, but I'd never seen it. And we saw the blessing of God. I saw the blessing of God. I saw the favour of God. Whenever I went into a meeting, they were just always really open to me being there. Whenever we decided that we wanted to help someone, they were always happy to have our help. And just this weekend, I posted up on Facebook that we're about to kickstart the building of the kitchen. And probably 60% of the people that have commented on that are not Christians at all. And just are absolutely thrilled for what God has done. And we've seen the favour of God. We've seen the blessing of God. But sometimes in your life, you won't be feeling it on the inside. That's when the rubber meets the road. That's when you have to say, Jesus, you're first. And I'm not talking about you've got to be praying 1 to 2 hours a day. I'm not saying that you've got to be reading screeds of your Bible. Some days I would just get up, say, I love you, Jesus, and then get into my day. Other days I started a little bit better. But if you place God first in your life, in the midst of your struggle, in the midst of your challenge, you give him access to your life, and you can see the blessing of God's hand on your life in spite of your circumstances. Now, you'll all be happy to know I feel a lot better about your life now and the church. Yeah, it's okay. I'm not resigning. I'm still going to keep on keeping on. Now, if you'll do what Joseph did, then all of heaven worked together on your behalf. Now, the significance of Joseph's life and his commitment to God played out partially during the latter part of his life, but it wasn't for another 2,000 years that the true impact of Joseph's faithfulness was seen when Jesus strode onto the world scene, born into the nation of Israel, a nation that could have been snuffed out of existence if Joseph hadn't remained faithful to God through the trial of his heart. Be like Joseph, and God will notice. In conclusion, if I could have the music back, that'd be great. It's the time. It's 11:04. Is that good, Erin? Yeah. She's got to go to work after today. She's Dad, you've got to finish on time, right? And I said, I'll finish on time if they get me up there on time. And I was a little bit late. I just want to put that out there. But in conclusion, here are the words that Joseph shared about his time in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favourite with the prison warden, and the Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. I can't promise you that what the struggles and the challenges that you're facing will be over next week. I wish I could. I wish I could wave a wand, a magic wand over your life and say everything's going to work out perfectly as of next week. I can't promise you that. But we can take incredible hope from the words of Joseph. Here, the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his unfailing love. The Lord made Joseph a favourite with the prison warden, and the Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. So you can be in the middle of a prison and still be incredibly successful. You can be in the middle of a prison and still have the favour of God on your life. You can be in the middle of a prison and know and experience God's faithful love. And some of you today, you're not in a physical prison. You're in another type of prison. It could be a prison of lost hope. It could be in a prison of relationships that have gone sour. It could be in a prison of just you're not happy with where you currently are in life, and you just feel so constrained at this point in time and you can't see it changing. Well, obviously none of you are in a physical prison because you're here at church today. But there are other prisons that lock us up, that suck the very joy and life out of our hearts. But you can have the same testimony that Joseph had here. And that's what I really sense the Holy Spirit is wanting to say to every single person here this morning. Joseph's rescue, the rescuing of Joseph, it didn't come from his family. Joseph wasn't rescued by his family. He was actually thrown into prison by his family. Joseph wasn't rescued by his ingenuity and his incredible escape plan which got him out of prison. He stayed in prison until Pharaoh released him. Joseph got out of that prison because he never lost sight of God. Can you imagine if Joseph, when he got thrown into that prison. Can you imagine if he had said, that's it, I'm not going to have anything to do with God? And then the baker and the cupbearer got thrown in, and they had a dream, and Joseph's sitting back thinking, yeah, I had a dream once, and look where I ended up. God obviously can't give us dreams that come to pass. I'm not going to try and help you with your dream because my dream, look at my dream. But he didn't. He didn't. He continued trusting God in a place where he didn't have what he was trusting him for. Because you don't trust God for something you already have. And in the midst of that, God was there. You know, there's something really unique about Joseph's story. He's one of the very few characters in the Old Testament where nothing bad is said about him. I mean, he was a bit naive. He was a bit sort of silly when he was a young kid because he dogged on his brothers to his dad. That was one of the reasons why they were a bit ticked off with him. Because when they were doing stuff out in the field that was a bit, shady, he told his dad. And they got in trouble. And then he gets this nice coat from his dad, his multicoloured coat. And then he has his dream and he tells them all. But he was just naive. He was just... Here's something, and I'm going to close just on this last thought, because it might just help somebody here today. Joseph had already forgiven his brothers before he even got thrown into prison. I wonder if we would be that quick. Because unforgiveness can just sit in our hearts and eat away at our lives. Joseph had already forgiven his brothers. And then he was able to look them in the eye and say, you meant this for bad, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. If it wasn't for you doing what you did, you guys would all be dead now. So would I. But he was only able to say that because he had already forgiven them. That's why I think Joseph is a really unique character in the Old Testament. And if you're a young person today, he would be a good one to emulate in your own life. Life is going to throw some curveballs, but if you do what Joseph did, you will have the hand of God on your life all the days of your life. And who knows what you might be responsible for in the future. Let's pray.